Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Apex. I'm Hector Kochak, and joining us this week is film producer, financier, director, and automotive entrepreneur Jim Glickenhaus. With an enviable car collection which leaves motorsports fans and especially Ferrari aficionados slack-jawed with envy, Jim is also the owner and venerable leader of Scuderia Cameron Glickenhaus, a proudly American low-volume manufacturer of elite road and racing cars, competing in the world's most demanding races. Described by One magazine as possibly America's last real privateer, and an inspiration for anyone who has dreamed about becoming a race car constructor, we're delighted to have him with us today. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be with you.
So I just wanted to begin by asking how you got interested in cars. I've read about you as a young boy standing with your nose pressed to the glass of Luigi Cinetti's Ferrari dealership in New York every Saturday. What was it there that inspired you?
Well, I always loved mechanical objects. Whenever my parents gave me a toy or a clock or something, I would always take it apart. I was very curious to learn how things worked. And when I got old enough to ride a bicycle, I used to ride it all over. And I had heard of Ferraris, and I knew that Mr. Cinetti had a dealership that was about 20 miles from my home. So I bicycled over and I looked in through the glass, and eventually he came out and let me come in. And then eventually he let me sit in the cars and touch the steering wheel, not the shifter. And then over the years, we developed a friendship. And when he began working on Ferraris, especially race cars, at his facility in Greenwich, he often would send me on my bicycle to get parts.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Mr. Cinetti, he played a significant part in the history of Ferrari in North America at the time. So by all accounts, he was a real privateer and an accomplished racer who had somehow managed to convince Enzo Ferrari to make him factory agent for the USA. I think I've read that you said in an interview that he was, when you were slightly older, keen for you to go racing, and that you developed a good personal bond with him. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, the legend has it that Mr. Ferrari was sitting in his office in Modena on Christmas Day, and he didn't even have enough money to heat the factory. And Mr. Cinetti went to visit him and wish him happy holidays. And Mr. Cinetti said, "Look, if you can build road cars, I can sell them in the United States." And Ferrari was reluctant. He said, "This car thing isn't really working. I think I'm going to go back to machine tools." But he changed his mind and built some road cars, and Mr. Cinetti was able to sell them. So he became an integral part, and frankly, the future of Ferrari. Mr. Cinetti was also a very accomplished driver, both. He started long before Ferrari, and he also knew that if he could find wealthy gentlemen drivers, that he could talk them into buying race cars and going racing. And Mr. Cinetti's most famous outing was at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, where he wound up driving 23 and 3/4 hours by himself. His rich privateer or gentleman driver got scared, and Mr. Cinetti told me that that after 20 minutes, that driver pulled over, and he got in the car, and he said when he pressed the brakes on the Mulsanne, he heard a scraping sound and then shattering glass. And the next time he went into the pits, it turned out it was a whiskey bottle.
How extraordinary.
The driver had left. And the one thing that Mr. Cinetti taught me was that no matter how wonderful Ferrari race cars were, they could be improved. And it's kind of ironic that the last Ferrari to win first overall at Le Mans, which was back in 1965, was a Mr. Cinetti's North American Racing Team 250 LM that was heavily modified by Mr. Cinetti in Greenwich. And I actually helped and worked on that car. And I went out and, we drilled holes in it to make it lighter. We went to the local speed shop and bought better ignition wires because as Mr. Canetti said, the Ferrari ignition wires were crap. And he basically told me, taught me um, that you could improve things. So this was my first experience with modifying cars. And later, when I was a teenager, I told him I was going to go to Europe to hitchhike around during the summer and that I wanted to see a Formula One race. And he said, well, go to the French Grand Prix, which at the time was in Rouen. He said, show up on Wednesday before the race. When you see the Ferrari transporter, tell them you're a friend of mine. And so I did that. And I went up to the truck driver and I said, I'm a friend of Mr. Canetti's. He didn't really speak much English. And he said, start unloading the truck. And that was the day when everybody pitched in. I mean, when the Lotus guys showed up in Graham Hill, we helped them carry down heavy things and they helped us. And at night we cooked, pasta on a camping stove in the back of where the transporter was. And I met Jackie Ickx, who was a young guy who drove himself at a Fiat 124 from Paris and then drove the race. And, racing was much different in those days.
Yes, it certainly sounds like it. I mean, what an extraordinary tale. I think times have changed slightly. And I suppose we have Mr. Canetti to thank for convincing Enzo to continue with the racing cars. Talking about cars, I've read that your first major race to road car was a Lola T70 Can-Am you purchased after having success in the film industry at a fairly young age. But did you have any memorable cars of your own before that, or get involved in any kind of motorsport-based fun as a young man? I think I've seen mention of a 54 Studebaker sort of going at crazy speeds up and down motorways, but I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, my first car was that I built up myself, and it was my first car, was a 54 Studebaker that I put a 421 cubic inch Pontiac Catalina motor with 3 carburetors that I got out of a junkyard from a Catalina that had crashed. And I put in a Corvette gearbox and a Schaefer clutch. In those days, there were companies, mail order companies, that you could write to, and they would sell you adapter bell housings and clutches and motor mounts, so you could install anything and anything. There was no problem. And so that 54 Studebaker, which was a very cool and beautiful car, it was designed by Raymond Loewy, who designed the Coke bottle and the Studebaker Avanti eventually. And I used to go to Wingdale, which was a very small quarter-mile drag strip up about an hour north of where I lived. And I used to go up there and drag race it and try to drive it home. And if it broke down, tow it back and things like that. After I wrote and directed The Exterminator, I made a bit of money, and I took some of that money and I invested it with my dad in Wall Street. And the rest of it, I went out and bought a Ferrari. It was a 275 GTB2 alloy coupe, long nose. It was a wonderful car. It had entered the Targa Florio under a privateer. And at the time, I remember I spent less than $6,000 for that car.
How extraordinary.
I loved it. I drove it 55,000 miles. I drove it in the rain, the sleet, the snow. And on the day that they dropped the speed limit to 55 miles an hour in the United States because of the situation in Iran, I, as an act of civil disobedience, and I was young and stupid back then, but I drove from Boston to New York City from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. So I drove it in 2 hours, which was an average speed of about 107 miles an hour. And I was hoping to get arrested and, make a political point, but no one even stopped me. So I had that car. That was an amazing time. The 275, which was a road sports car, people were kind of interested in, but the old race cars, people had no interest in it. I mean, I remember begging my father to loan me the money to buy a 250 GTO on a trailer for about $6,000. And,
In
you know,
retrospect, that sounds like it would have been quite a wise decision.
yeah, and I in later years, I would mention it to him, and he said, "Look, Jim, in the 60s, anything you bought was a wise decision." He said the entire initial public offering of Microsoft was $1 million. So he said, if you had bought that, you would have been a lot wealthier than if you bought your 250 GTO. And it put it kind of in perspective. But I loved race cars, and I loved the idea of driving them on the road. So I saw a small ad in the New York Times. This was, of course, way before the internet or anything. So the Sunday New York Times in the classified section had a little thing that said sports and competition cars. And all the enthusiasts would, on Saturday night at midnight, you could buy the Times. And so you'd go out and buy it. And then if you saw something interesting, as soon as Sunday morning came, you'd call. And sure enough, I saw a Lola T70 X Donna Upensky, and at the time it was owned by Andy Warhol Productions, and the guy I got on the phone was Andy Warhol's business manager. Warhol had bought it. He was going to use it in a movie that was sort of a spoof of the yellow Rolls Royce. Warhol never got around to doing it, but he wanted to sell the car. So I bought it, and it was a flat out Can-Am race car. It had no windshield, no mufflers, and it was as Penske and Donahue had raced it, and it actually had won 8 major Can-Am races and a few championships, and was a wonderful, wonderful car. So I went down and road registered it. In those days, no one knew what a Lola was, and as long as it had treaded tires and seat belts, basically, and headlights, I cut headlights into it. You could road register it. And then after a while, the cops said to me, I don't know, driving this thing is an open Can-Am car with no windshield. Maybe you should put a windshield in it. So I wrote to Lola, and I gave them the serial number of the car I had, and they answered by airmail. I remember it still took about a month to get a reply, and they offered to sell me a coupe body, which they did, and they shipped it, and I put it on, and that was my first race to road conversion, and I've owned that car since 1972. And I probably put 40 or 50,000 road miles on it. And it's a wonderful car. I still have it today. And I learned a lot about what makes a really cool road car.
That seems to have been quite the special first car for a collection. I don't think many people can boast such an interesting first car. Speaking of your collection, I think 1967 seems a real standout year for you as a collector, with you owning the Bandini Amon P3-4, which won the 24 Hours of Daytona, the 412P Ferrari, which took third at Spa in that year, and of course, your Bruce McLaren Ford GT Mark IV, which came in fourth at Le Mans. How did you come to own those, and what is it about those cars and that year that's so special to you?
Well, 1967 was an amazing year. I turned 17, and the future was limitless. I mean, the music was just fantastic. The films were changing. The cars were magnificent, and it was really before. It was the dawn of understanding aerodynamics. So the Ferraris were still being built to look very beautiful, and the Ford Mark IV was perhaps the first time that any scientific thought was given to aerodynamics. And I know they put that car in a wind tunnel. I think Ferrari before that had made wind tunnel models, but Ford used a full-size wind tunnel in that car. But in 1967, 1 million people went to Le Mans. The audience was incredible. I mean, 1 million people would go to the Indy 500. the music, as I said, was exploding in 1969. I went to Woodstock, and the groups that you heard, and the influence that it had on music, really for many, many, many years, was amazing. So that summer of 67, 68, 69 always stuck in my head. And I think it's fair to say that the 67 prototypes were really the last prototypes that looked like what an enthusiast would dream a sports car could look like, and still were possible to drive on the road. You had Le Mans, which was a street circuit. You had the Targa Florio, which was basically roads. And even purpose-built racetracks back in the 60s were a lot curvier and twistier, and more like roads. They weren't billiard smooth in the pavement. They had bumps and stuff. So this really appealed to me. After 67, the French really, well, actually after 69 or starting in 67, they wanted the French cars to be able to compete. So they dropped the prototype specifications from sort of 7 liters down to 3 liters. And both Ferrari and Ford stopped racing for a while. And then they came back as, quote, production sports cars like the 917 or the 512S, and then later the 512M. And that Steve McQueen featured in his movie Le Mans. But they allegedly had built 25 examples of them, but Porsche admitted that a lot of them were unable to run, and it was on a freezing winter day when the FIA inspector came, and he looked at them parked all in a garage, and he pointed to one. He said, "Okay, start that one." And Porsche said, luckily, he had picked one that would start, and so the car got homologated. And those were very interesting cars. They weren't really great cars. The 512 had a lot of problems with it. It wasn't really the best design. And the 917 was a complete widowmaker in the beginning. I mean, it killed.
I think I remember that also there were magnesium frames, or there was something like that where they didn't.
Yeah, the chassis was completely brittle, and they actually stuck an tire pressure gauge. They welded it into the chassis, and they pressurized the chassis. And they told the drivers if they were driving and they saw the gauge go down, it meant that the chassis was cracking and going to come completely apart. And they said, get out of the car. Don't touch the brakes, because it'll just blow up basically, and jump out of the car. So it was a lot different times. And your feet in a 917 are in front of the axle, as a lot of people unfortunately learned. So they were pretty dangerous. Now, Ferrari did develop the 512 a bit. And interestingly enough, Mark Donohue and Roger Penske bought one and really developed it and made it a much better car with American ingenuity. But the thing that I think it's fair to say about both the 512 and the 917, they really were kind of impractical to drive on the road. So
compared to the P34 and the 412, I mean, as you
exactly
say, you wouldn't turn up at a friend's house in a 917.
No, exactly. And people did drive them. I mean, Dino Martin Jr. drove one of the 412Ps for years in LA. And, I've been able to put a lot of miles on mine. Listen, they're not like a Toyota, but you can certainly wake up early on a Sunday morning and drive them in a 100-mile loop, stop for lunch, and then drive home. And they work. And I have driven my P34, the Daytona winning car, on the historic Targa Florio, which was just an amazing experience. I met Nino Vaccarella again, and he drove it with me. And at the 100th anniversary of the Targa Florio, the government of Italy invited that car back to Italy, and they shut the original section of the Targa Florio from the start to Certa, and we drove on the whole road with no oncoming traffic. It was an amazing experience.
That's extraordinary. Um, from just a bit more on your collection, from my research, it strikes me how often Pininfarina appears in your story. I believe you bought the 1970 Ferrari Modulo and the 1970 Dino Competizione directly from them. And then in 2005, Andrea Pininfarina approached you with a proposal to build your dream car, which eventually became the incredible Ferrari P45 by Pininfarina. What influence has Pininfarina had on the story of SCG?
Well, I think that Pininfarina represented the purest and best form of design for Ferraris. I think Mr. Ferrari was very interested in the engines, the gearboxes, the chassis, the brakes, and he knew that he really did not have an artistic aesthetic sense for design, and he relied on Pininfarina to clothe his creations. He had other coach builders, but I think it's fair to say that Pininfarina was the major coach builder for Mr. Ferrari. I mean, the story went that when they unveiled the F40, Mr. Ferrari had not seen it before the unveiling, and when they took off the sheet on it, he said, you know, "Bella Macchina," and he knew enough to leave Pininfarina alone and to let them do what they wanted to do. Um, After Mr. Ferrari, you know, Luca de Montezemolo came in to run the company. And in fairness to Luca, he revitalized Ferrari. At the time, they were making very poor road cars, you know, the 328s and the 348s. And Formula One was in shambles. And Luca revitalized both the production and the road cars and Formula One. And I think when he wanted to make a supercar, which became the Enzo, or the Ferrari Enzo Ferrari, um, it or the Enzo Ferrari or whatever it's really called. He wanted to pay an homage to Formula One, and his brief was to make the supercar, unlike the F40, which certainly looked like a Le Mans prototype or a road going prototype. He wanted to make the Enzo a visual homage to Formula One. And he also became much more hands on the design than Mr. Ferrari did. I don't know if Mr. Ferrari, uh, he certainly didn't go often. He may have gone to Turin once or twice, but usually Sergio Pininfarina told me that they would meet in between, you know, uh, Modena and Torino. And he certainly didn't have a monthly or a weekly or a daily input into the style, Mr. Ferrari, but Luca did. And at that time, there was some pushback from the public when the Enzo first came out. And they said, wow, it's not beautiful. It doesn't look like a Ferrari. And there was some similar pushback on some other cars. I think it was like the 550 and other Ferraris. People said they're very bland. So at that time, Sergio Pininfarina and his son Andrea, who was really the driving force at that time behind Pininfarina and running the company, they wanted to find someone who would commission a coach-built Ferrari that would enable them to make, in their minds, a beautiful Ferrari again. And it was a difficult thing because they needed to find a customer, one who, I guess, first and foremost could write the check, but secondly, who would not be afraid of, quote, what Ferrari might do to them for embarking on such a venture. You know, at that time, people, and I think maybe perhaps to today, although I don't know, people were just terrified. Well, if you annoy Ferrari, they'll never, I don't know what they thought they would do to them. Like, you know.
But I suppose today it's, they won't even let you buy the first car, which will let you buy the second car, which might eventually get you the third. I think there's
Exactly.
yeah.
And back, so, Andrea Pininfarina got in touch with me through Christian Phillipson, who was a mutual acquaintance. And Christian basically, he met me at Villa d'Este where I was there, I think with my Duesenberg. And he said, would you consider commissioning a one-off car with Pininfarina? And I said, yeah, I would consider it. And then basically they asked me what I would propose to do. And I said, look, I want to take the latest, greatest Ferrari supercar, the Enzo, and I want to reimagine it as an homage to my P34 and the great Ferrari racing cars like Dino Competizione and the 512S. And Andrea thought about it and got back to me and said, okay, we'll do that. Shortly thereafter, I got the chance to buy the Maranello concessionaire 412P. So I now had two Ferrari P cars. And I think Pininfarina was scared that instead of paying for Ferrari, for this one-off project, I had bought another P car instead. And I said, no, they were completely unconnected. I still wanted to do the one-off. And that car, it's a funny car. Ferrari had nothing to do with the car. The only thing, of course, they had to do with it is they built the original Enzo. And I bought the last unsold Enzo that was at a Ferrari dealer in California. It had been destined for Argentina, but the financial crisis, the guy in Argentina never paid for it. So Ferrari still owned the car, and they sold it to me. It was brand new. They didn't have a clue what I was going to do with it. And I think U.S. Customs was a little confused because I took it, basically a brand new Ferrari from California, and shipped it over to Europe, still with the plastic on the seats. But anyway, it arrived at Pininfarina. I went over, I drove it a little, and we went into what I wanted to do. And I said there were some mechanical things I wanted to improve a lot. The original tires on the Ferrari Enzo really were terrible, the Bridgestones, and the car did not have enough front tire, so it had terrible turning. The other thing was it had so much front overhang that it was virtually undrivable on the street. I mean, on some crowned roads, you had to straddle the middle of the road so the car wouldn't bottom out, and it was extremely difficult to get into, to get up, to go from a flat road up a hill, or to get it on a tow truck if you needed to, or a transporter, or to get it in your driveway. So I wanted to shorten the front overhang. I wanted to take a lot of weight out of it. And I also did not like the interior. I did not find it intuitive. So I explained how I wanted to move a lot of controls around so that when I reached my hand out, I would access the control I wanted. And we began the process.
Comprehensive re-engineering then.
Oh yes, we changed 200 systems on the car. We re-engineered 200 things. We used design cues from my P34, from the 512S, from Dino Competizione, and other cars. But I think the great thing that Pininfarina did was I would have been fine with making it more of a visual replica to my P34, but they really pushed me to make a design that would stand on its own. And my kids were instrumental in having me agree to that because they felt they liked the more modern look of some of the sketches, and that's the direction we went. And Ferrari knew nothing about the car. There were rumors on the internet. And when the car was just about finished, Luca heard about it, and he flew to Turin. And Andrea said, I knew it was serious when he shut off the helicopter, because normally he would leave the helicopter running, come into Pininfarina, yell and scream and tell him what to do, go back in the helicopter and fly away. But this time he shut the helicopter off, and he came in and he said, how could you have done this? How could he have done this? This is not a Ferrari. we'll never work with Pininfarina again. He'll never buy another Ferrari and whatnot. And Andrea said, Luca, I don't think you understand. Our business for a long time has been coach building. We have rebodied many vehicles, you know, and over the years, this is what we do. He's a client. He wanted to do it, and he doesn't care if it's a Ferrari. He told us he's perfectly happy to put a Pininfarina badge on the car. And then Luca said, "Who is this guy?" And so Luke and Andrea said, "It's Jim Glickenhaus." And he said, "Oh, that guy. I mean, that's the guy who has the Daytona P34. And what is the story with that?" Because there was like a lot of stories on the internet about it. And Andrea said, "Look, basically, after Le Mans, the car burned, you scrapped it, and he found it and, resurrected it, as, Ferrari Class C sent in a letter to me that I shouldn't have taken parts out of their garbage and resurrected 0846. But anyway, so Lucas said, that's what happened? We threw something out, he found it and restored the car? And Andrea said, yeah, that's the short story. And he said,
you can't keep a good Ferrari down, clearly.
Yeah, and he said, well, that's funny, okay. I want to see the car. Then they went into Italian opera. I had already told Andrea I was fine with Luca seeing the car, but, he was a little annoyed at how vociferous Luca was. So he said, well, you can't see the car. It's Jim's car. You just told me it's not a Ferrari. And Luca said, call him up and, tell him I want to see the car. So Luca went into his office, shut the door, had a couple of cappuccinos, pretended he was calling me, and said to Luca, okay, Jim says you can see the car. Now, the reason this was opera was the car was already on the roof under a tarp where they unveiled the cars on a turntable. And they went up the stairs, and Luca was, still, this will never be a Ferrari, and we're going to kill him, and we're going to kill you, and blah, blah. I'm speaking figuratively. But they got to the top, and they unveiled the car, and Andrea said it was the only time in his life that he saw Luca de Montezemolo stop talking. And he said, Luca looked at it, and he said, oh, it's beautiful. It's a Ferrari. Let's go have lunch.
What more do you need?
Yeah, so that was it. And that's how this car became Ferrari. And then we argued about what to call it. He just wanted to call it Ferrari P45, and Andre insisted that Pininfarina's name was on it, and there was a lot more of that. But eventually got settled. It's an official Ferrari. It's in their records. It's actually in their parts computer under Ferrari P45 and the VIN number. And
so thankfully a happy ending.
Yeah, it was a happy ending, exactly.
Yeah, so just to take the collecting theme a bit further, you've mentioned before that you're well known for road registering your cars and putting significant miles on them. I think you've even taken your precious 1947 159 Ferrari Spider Corsa on a trip to Sicily, as well as racing it. Certain people in the collector community would probably blanch at the idea of taking some of these priceless cars out onto the road, let alone the track. Although I think, to be fair, it feels like some part of the car world are beginning to rebel against that attitude. Why is your attitude different? And do you think it maybe shocked any former owners of these cars or other collectors?
Well, I think that people really have no clue what real race cars are. Real race cars roll out of the factory, and on the first day, they're modified. Mechanics take things off, they put things on, they cut holes in them, they file things down, they make them go faster. If they break, they fix them. If there's two P4s sitting in the pits and one crashes, they take parts off the one that crashed and used it on the ones that didn't. So, I'm always amused when you go to Pebble Beach and people are judging competition Ferraris and, making statements about them that are just totally absurd. Oh, this is original. I mean, there are no original Ferrari race cars, none, zero, end of discussion. So the originality of it or changing it for use never bothered me. I mean, for example, if you want to drive a race car on the road, you have to modify the brakes so that they work. On the road at slow speeds, you have to put on cooling fans or they'll overheat and destroy the engines. You often have to change the gear ratios so that they are much lower because the speed you go on the roads is much less than you go on a race course. You also have to modify the clutch so that if you're stuck on a hill at a red light, you can get going without, rolling backwards into a pickup truck or demolishing the car. So I never had any issue, modifying. I always tried to do it sympathetically so that it could be put back to how it was original. I kept as many of the original parts that we took off or modified, but I didn't worry about that. And I also love driving them. I mean, to me, I've never understood guys who have F40s with 300 miles on them and they take them in an enclosed trailer, they bring them to a concourse, they push them off, and they stand around all day talking about their immaculate F30 with 300, F40 with 300 miles on it. It's ridiculous. I mean, I own Ferraris that have gone 2,500 miles in 24 hours at a race. And it certainly didn't hurt their value. My Ford Mark IV, I think, went 3,300 miles in 24 hours. That didn't hurt its value. And the most valuable Ferraris, the P cars or the 250 GTOs, they don't have odometers. So this is almost like a fetish that people have for low mile cars. And, not to be too crude about it, but, I once made the remark that, not driving your Ferrari is like not having sex with your girlfriend, with your supermodel girlfriend, because she'll be more desirable to the next guy that comes along. I mean, really, it's insane.
It's quite a powerful way of putting it. And I suppose the tyranny of matching numbers and things like that doesn't hold much sway with Glickenhaus.
No, it's completely meaningless because let me say this. When Ferrari had a car and it broke, they would take chassis plates off one car and put it on another car and race, or they would fit it to the carnet, or they would restamp engines. They would restamp chassis. A chassis would crash. They would cut part of it off and weld on another part of it. So the idea of a pristine original race car is just absurd. And quite frankly, there's so much bullshit at some of these concourses about, quote, pristine original Ferrari road cars. I mean, there are restorers who make a huge amount of money convincing wealthy people that they have the knowledge to get them a prize at Pebble Beach or wherever, and that if they listen to them and do exactly what they say, they'll return it to the way it was when it left the Ferrari factory. To me, I don't know if any of those people have ever seen a cars that left the Ferrari factory. The race cars were very primitive. I mean, I remember Roger Penske telling a friend of mine, Alberto Pedretti, that he had just gotten a brand new Ferrari 250 LM and that it was a used car. And he was very angry. And Enzo called Alberto and said, go out and, calm Roger down. And Alberto looked at it and he said, Mr. Penske, when Ferrari finishes a car, even if it's brand new, they take it out, they test it, they don't clean it up, and they send it to you. And this is a new car. It's just that, it's been tested. And for someone who races in real races now, I completely understand what this means. I mean, we have race cars we've built that have been crashed, leaving the pits on their first outing because the driver was so hopped up that they crossed the pit line, the paint, before the tires were warm and they lost it. So the car crashes. So you pull parts off and you put on other parts and you swap body parts. And, 20 years later at Pebble Beach, there are people claiming, oh, yes, this is exactly as it left the Ferrari factory. There are, of the Ferrari P cars, the only one existent today that has its original chassis, engine, gearbox, and original body as it left the Ferrari factory, and a little bit of its original paint, is my 412P, the Maranello concessionaire car. Now, the reason is because late in its life, when it still had the original body that had not been crashed, David Piper wanted to keep racing it. So he stripped off that body and put it in his garden and built a fiberglass body that he raced the car in. And many years after he sold it, the owner of the 412P tracked down the original body and stuck it in his garage. And when I bought the car, he casually mentioned that he still had the original body, and did I want it? And I said yes. And I began a painstaking restoration to save the original body, which had been corroded and had issues, as much of the paint as we could. And I put it back on. So as 0854, my 412P exists today, it is extremely original. But it's very rare because Piper even had a crash where the car caught on fire. Now, what burned, luckily, was the fiberglass body. So the original body wasn't destroyed, and the engine and chassis and gearbox were fine, and the car was racing 6 months later. So it shows that the car was not burned to a crisp. But if he hadn't stripped off the original body and left it in his garden, it would have been burned up and lost forever. And the most original P4 existing, Lawrence Stroll's, is a magnificent car, and it's very original, but it has a spider body on it, not the original coupe body that it had when it left the factory, because during the racing season, Ferrari kept racing it, and when it went to the last races, which was very hot outside, they converted it into a spider. Now, that doesn't diminish its value in any way. It's a magnificent car that was changed by Ferrari in period to make it a better race car. And I'm not in any way implying that if it had its original coupe body, it would be more valuable or whatnot. I love seeing the history in these cars, but there is so much bullshit that goes on in the concourse lawn about, oh, this is original and that. I mean, there are competition cars that I've seen at Pebble Beach that basically the only thing original in them is their chassis plate. 100% of the rest of the car has been remanufactured over the years.
So that's a very interesting insight. I think it's quite eye-opening. I mean, speaking of factories and bringing it to Scuderia Glickenhaus. So your application to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to be a low-volume manufacturer was approved in 2017. And now SCG is a company which manufactures road cars, race cars, which run the Nürburgring 24 hours, amongst other things. Le Mans hypercars, which we'll discuss in a moment, as well as extreme off-road vehicles like the Boot, which humiliated Ford by winning the Baja 1000 last year. What determines that huge breadth of interests for you?
Well, the first thing is that when we began making road legal versions of a race car, we were under a section of law that had been started by President Obama in 2015. And in 2017, I felt that it had become law because the organizing authorities in the United States had not changed it or commented on it. And I announced that, therefore, I was going to build cars under that law. And 2 years went by, and then I maintained that under the law, the government was stopped from challenging that. However, as we began to grow, we stopped making cars under that law. And that law now has been changed to the point where we could not make cars under it because it only allows you to manufacture an absolute replica of a car that was made 25 years ago, that you have the legal right to replicate, and it has to be the exact width, height, and length. So the cars that we manufactured under the 2015 law no longer could be made. And we had a meeting with NHTSA, and we said, look, we now will meet all required federal motor vehicle safety standards. We will crash test the cars, and we will work with the EPA to get certifications for our engines for both the United States and California, which has separate regulations. They're called CARB. And it's just said, fantastic. Just going forward, you're going to operate under the law, under the regular manufacturer's law. There's a misconception. People say we're a low volume manufacturer and they think it refers to some special law. It doesn't. It simply refers to the fact that we manufacture less than 5,000 vehicles a year. That's what the definition of a low volume manufacturer is. You make up to 4,999 vehicles a year. So it has nothing to do with the Obama law or the previous law that we made a very few cars under. And now we crash test. They're fully US motor vehicle compliant. They're emissions compliant, which is a little easier for us to do because we're basically buying brand new emissions compliant engines from OEMs and installing them without modification into our vehicles. But in doing that, I wanted to have basically two types of vehicles that we could sell for road use. One of them is our 004, which is my ultimate sports car. It's a three-seater like the original Ferrari Agnelli three-seater was, and then later McLaren copied in their F1. It's a mid-engine car. It's a very beautiful car. It pays an homage to Dino Competizione and a Corvette show car called the Corvette Indy. And it also has elements of many of the beautiful sports racers of the 60s and early 70s. And it has some bits of Ferrari P45 in it by Pininfarina. So that is our sports car. We make both a road and a race version of it, and we make it so you can get it with a real manual transmission. So it's a real basic sports car with a bit of a retro interior, round analog gauges, or you can get it as our GT3 version with much more aero, a lot more horsepower, up to 840 horsepower versus 650 horsepower, and a paddle shift transmission. And that is really as close to a GT3 car for the road that you can get. And then the second vehicle we make is, of course, our boot. A number of years ago, I saw Steve McQueen's boot for auction at Pebble Beach. I was just astounded with it, with the engineering of it. It turns out it was engineered by a guy, Vic Hinkey, who did the lunar rover, and he took the money he got from NASA, and in the same room, he built the Baja boot. And I have a picture of them rolling the lunar rover out of that building with the boot in the background. And Steve McQueen found out about it. He loved the Baja. They got it to McQueen. McQueen raced it. That vehicle raced for 14 years. It beat the Bronco. In one race, the Bronco beat it. It was the basis of the Mint 400. It raced there when Hunter Thompson wrote his amazing Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And at the end of the book, he said, "Who won? Maybe nobody." And but anyway, I love the boot. And I, said to my son, who had now joined the company, we have to make a road legal version of it. And he said, but it's so different than your background, than your sports cars and your racing cars. And I said, I think we can do it. And we got the people out in California I called SCORE. I asked them who I should use. They put me in touch with Darren Skelton, who has won Paris to Dakar when it was Paris to Dakar in class. He's won the Baja many times. He was hired by Kia to make a Paris to Dakar vehicle. He was hired by Ford to race their Raptor at the Baja, and he was the guy using Armada Engineering to design a road legal and yet Baja capable version. And the greatest thrill was driving that thing from Los Angeles down to Ensenada, racing the Baja 1000 and driving it home. And it's the most fun thing to drive in the world. It's like surfing or skiing. You drive off road, it's like deep powder skiing, and it's so comfortable because it has so much suspension travel that you like float over bumps. And on the roads, giant potholes mean nothing. So we're very excited about that. And that, of course, is engineered by Podium out in California. And our sports car is engineered by Podium Advanced Technology, who I've worked with for many years. And they are also building our Le Mans hypercar, and they build our race cars. And I think if we expand into Europe with our road-going sports cars and even our boots, we very well may use them to build those over in Europe.
It's quite an incredible range of cars and extremely unique. And just mentioning the hypercars there, I understand that you've played a significant role in shaping the Le Mans hypercar regulations, and Scuderia Glickenhaus is, of course, developing the W07 for 2021. The last 12 months have shown that development can be a rocky road, even for well-known sports car manufacturers, but you guys seem to have a drive to show up and fight that few other outfits have. Is Le Mans more than just a race for you? And what point does Scuderia Glickenhaus have to prove at Le Mans with the 007?
Well, this is me going back to 1967 and showing up and racing Le Mans. And that's all we have nothing to prove. We just have to show up. And I want to show up with a beautiful car and a fast car and a car that could have a chance to win. But that in and of itself is all I'm looking to do. The road was a very rocky road. It was caused by a lot of bizarre bullshit from companies like Aston Martin, who said, oh, we'll only race if we can make something that looks like our Valkyrie, and we want to use that engine, the Valkyrie, the V12, which was totally unsuited for racing. I mean, it's a big, heavy, large engine, so it's very hard to make an efficient LMP hypercar out of it. But we said, okay, we'll go with that. And because they knew that they couldn't get it very light, they wanted to raise the minimum weight and the maximum horsepower you could do. And then they pulled out. And so the only two real people who were left were Toyota and us. And it was a big problem for both of us. I mean, Toyota had finally reached a way to meet the 870 horsepower between hybrid and ICE. And we had thrown out our deal with Alfa Romeo because the Alfa Romeo engine could not make 870 horsepower in endurance tune. And we went with Pipo, who is a fantastic engine builder who builds WRC engines that have been very successful for many years. And they had a vision how they could do it. And then we had to switch again to the lower rating of 670 horsepower, but we still had to find a way to make the cars fast enough, because the problem is the ACO, while they knew these would be slower than the current hybrid LMP1s, they didn't want to slow them down too much, because then they'd be bumping into the LMP2s and then down the food chain. So it was a massive amount of rule change, and a lot of money was wasted going down stupid paths that later got changed. But we stuck with it, and
you're on track now, I understand, to turn up with a beautiful car that presumably, I think I've heard you say before, you can then drive home or to the restaurant in Lyon or wherever.
Exactly. So we actually will have a 2-car team. We will, we're doing our final aerodynamic testing this week. We will have the engine on the dyno in early October, and we will begin building up the car, and we will be at Sebring next year with 2 Glickenhaus 007 Le Mans hypercars, and we will race Sebring, Spa, and Le Mans. And we hope we will continue racing after that, but so far as we know, those are the only 3 races that have been scheduled for next year. We're sure they will schedule probably 3 more races. I don't know what they will be. And, we certainly hope to join the whole season, but we can't commit to something that we don't know what it is yet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But our goal is to race at Le Mans against the giants, who in this case will be Toyota, who certainly know a thing or two about Le Mans, and to have a car that is extremely competitive. But it doesn't matter where we finish or what happens. Just having been able to show up, I think, is a monumental achievement. But more importantly, I think people are going to be shocked when they see how competitive we are. I mean, we have a really competitive engine. We have a top aerodynamic team working on it. I think it's a pretty beautiful car, and I think we'll stand and deliver.
I have to say that sounds incredibly exciting, and I look forward to it. So, Jim, we're running up against time now, so I thought I'd just fire some quick fire questions at you just to finish off. First one is, what's the best car you've ever driven?
The best car that I've ever driven, the most fun vehicle I've ever driven is actually our Baja car. It's the most fun to drive off, because I mean, off-road you can still go at these exciting, crazy speeds. And, they're not, I mean, going 40 miles an hour off-road over giant bumps and whoops and floating through it is just fantastic. Best sports car? I really like Dino Competizione. It's light, it's small, it basically is a mini P4. You can toss it around. And in the mountain roads of Sicily, where I drove it in the Targa Florio, it was just an unforgettable experience. And I also love Ferrari P45 by Pininfarina. I mean, I did the same thing. I drove the Targa Florio in that with my wife. And when we were driving in the rain, in the mountains of Sicily, listening to opera, it was a pretty special experience.
That sounds amazing. Second quick fire question is, what's your favorite race circuit?
My favorite race circuit is probably the Nürburgring. I think it's the most like circuits were in the 60s. I mean, unfortunately now because of COVID, they can't have the massive crowds, but that will come back when we get vaccinations. But to me, the 24 Hours of Nürburgring is like Burning Man, Woodstock, and James Hunt and Niki Lauda and Stefan Beloff and all of that rolled up together.
Absolutely. Thirdly, if you could choose any driver in the world to race your 007 to victory at Le Mans next year, who would it be?
I think we're going to need 7 drivers for our 2 cars. So I think we will have some really amazing people who we will test in January. And I basically want, great drivers, but also who understand the challenges of endurance racing and frankly will listen to what the team tells them to do, because it is not possible to win at Le Mans if you just go off on your own. You really have to have a lot of strategy for pits, for BOP, for managing the car, for not crashing it, and just frankly running lap after lap at the right speed, and you can win. So I think we're going to have a lot of amazing, interesting people who may want to come over and drive for us, and I really look forward to that.
And the last question, what's the greatest lesson you've learned from your time in motorsport and the car industry?
I think the greatest lesson is that there are wonderful days and there are terrible days. And the key to success, in my opinion, is to keep on trucking. Not to let a failure just break up your momentum, but to just keep going. And, if you show up and you keep going, you have a chance.
And on that bombshell, Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on with us today. Thank you so very much for your time. And best of luck to Scuderia Glickenhaus in your upcoming races.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.